Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. It's the last day of 2019, a year that has seen continued violence in conflict zones all across Middle East. South Asia has seen its own fair share of unbridled violence, especially against Muslims. International forums whose sole reason for existence is conflict resolution and developing international cooperation, they have unapologetically been standing on the sidelines, completely useless in stopping and preventing the rising hate crimes against Muslims. There are 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, according to Pew Research, in the world today, so it is a big issue. A small example, since we do not have the time or scope to cover all the hate crime issues that have made headlines this year, a small example, in New Zealand, the mosque massacre in March this year, where a white supremacist killed 50 Muslim worshippers in Christchurch, though it did gather the kind of widespread condemnation from the world, and it saw immediate action on at least easy access to firearms from the New Zealand government. It also resulted in nearly a 600% increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes across Britain. It's not a trend unique to Britain, of course. It's been seen especially in Europe, across the United States, in Russia, in China. We can't possibly cover all these regions that were affected by racism and religious discrimination against Muslims, but we will be focusing on two specific areas that are very close to Newswire's heart, at least, because we have talked about them extensively. We've clubbed this anti-Muslim sentiment that we've seen and also want to elaborate more on the revival of this extreme right-wing Nazi and Hindutva-style atrocious policies that are directly targeting Muslims, affecting them for generations to come. And they're continuing unabated with the help of the powers that be. So today, speaking to us is Dr. Ather Zia. She's a Kashmiri written author. She's joining us from Colorado. Dr. Zia has a doctorate degree from Department of Anthropology at the University of California at Irvine. We also have with us Dr. Ghazi Hamad, a Palestinian and an analyst. Also, he's joining us from Gaza today. Dr. Hamad was the chairman of the Border Crossing Authority in Gaza Strip. He was the deputy foreign minister also in the Hamas government. I want to start with you, Dr. Zia. 2019, it comes to an end tonight. Now, reflecting back, the Muslims of Jammu and Kashmir, while they've seen decades of discrimination, they've seen decades of violence against them. But this year particularly, since August 5th, the revocation of Article 370 of the Indian Constitution that gave them some autonomy, they gave them some semblance of normalcy, though they remained in an internationally disputed region. Reflecting back on this year alone, share with us your thoughts on how things have changed for the Muslims there.
Well, I think it's become increasingly clear that what the Indian agenda has been so far, what has happened since 1947 is that the Article 370, which came into effect in 1949, it was slowly and steadily eroded by different governments. So it's not that only BJP has been key in doing this. It's been the other governments, quote unquote, the secular governments. But what has happened very recently with BJP, because they have a very clear agenda of creating a Hindu Rashtra. So this is a very militant, very extremist, and a terrorist Hindu supremacist state that has made its face very brazen. And now, as are happening in India with the citizen amendment law that has come into effect as an act, you kind of see the chronology that has been in effect since 1947 in a way. And what we see is an unfolding of an anti-Muslim, a very Islamophobic, a xenophobic agenda in which Kashmir becomes very key because it was and it is continuing to be at the moment at least a Muslim-dominated state. And what BJP has been saying from the very first instance from 1947 onwards, that they do not want Article 370, they want uniformity throughout the country, and they have never been for this special status. But that doesn't mean that Kashmir is just any other state that can be accommodated and integrated into India, because the founders, the forefathers of Indian Constitution, the forefathers of Indian independence movement, they did realize that Kashmir has its own nationalistic identity, which is why all things happened around it at that time. But now it's becoming increasingly clear with what is happening with the Muslims across India, with what's happening at the moment as we see this revolution building up At least I'd like to see that as a revolution of sorts, where the Muslims in India, that they kind of like wake up to what's happening to them, because they have been suffering as well. An anti-Muslim agenda that has been on a slow boil in different governments and has become pogroms and massacres. But at the moment, it's aflame. It's very volatile. So if you see in that chronology, Kashmir has been suffering a xenophobic ideal that India sees itself as a very nationalistic, a very Hindu state. So as we are wrapping the year, what's happening in Kashmir at the moment is this fear of settler colonialism, the fear that now that Article 370 is revocated, now that Article 35A, which used to promise Kashmiris territorial sovereignty, which meant that they had property rights, they had right to franchise, now that's been opened up. And as we see what's been happening since August 5th, there are several orders that have come into being. There are forest clearances happening, there is state land that's being identified. There are different ways, like the roads are being laid, all kinds of machinery which kind of integrates Kashmir to India, like blasting through these mountainous regions, laying down different kinds of, roads and railways. So you kind of see that happening. What earlier would take Kashmiri legislature and Kashmiri cabinets, they would take time to make decisions about what to do and what not to do. But they are being done away with as soon as possible. I think, in fact, it's been August 6th or 7th or something like that, within the first 10 days, that there were hundreds of clearances that were given by the forest, one of the committees that deals with forests. So you kind of see that creeping settler colonialism, you kind of see that danger, you see what is on the agenda, and Kashmiris are very cognizant of that. And now exacerbated by the fact that they are living under Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which gives military full control over the region. So put those two together, and we know what we are up against in Kashmir, which is a blatant Islamophobia, which is blatant anti-Muslim agenda, and also diluting the region to an extent that it no longer is a dominant Muslim majority state.
And this is, Dr. Hamad, something that has been mirrored in a way and publicly also claimed to be an inspiration from what the Israelis have done. At least with the BJP government, they look up to how the Israeli Authority has gone forward with their settler occupation and completely sort of unperturbed by whatever the UNSC has called it. In fact, with the kind of support it gets from the powers that right now dictate how any country moves forward. President Trump, he tweeted earlier in March that the United States recognizes Israel's authority over the Golan Heights, territory that Israel had illegally annexed from Syria after the '67 war. This kind of settler colonial sort of agendas, and in Palestine specifically, not just for Muslims, but all the other communities living there in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. How do you see 2019 closing for the voice of the Palestinians, for the plight of the Palestinians?
Yeah, I can see the situation in Palestine is very terrible. The occupation is still continuing in his aggression. Palestinians taking the lands, building settlements. I think they are supported by the American administration. Now they started to take more action, more dangerous action, especially to tell the world that Jerusalem is their capital. Now to annex the Golan Heights. Now they have a plan now also to annex the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. I think now their plan is very clear, is now to destroy any possibility for political solution, for Palestinian state, for peace process, for anything. So I think now who control Israel is the extremist parts in Israel. They now try to, as I said, they now just to serve this interest of Israel, to exclude any Palestinian partner. I think they think that it's a time for them, golden time for them, because the Arabs are sleeping, the Europeans are watching, the Americans, they are supporting Israel. They put the glasses of Israel on their eyes. They try to help Israel in any field. So I think now the time is very difficult for the Palestinian. And there is nothing in the horizon that there will be any perspective of solution in the future. Nothing is moving now. So I think now it is a heavy situation. We need now to reunify the Palestinians, now to have the national unity, now to rearrange our situation. I think that the Palestinian Authority, especially the President Abbas, should understand that there is no possibility for the peace of Israel, no peace with the occupation, no peace with the settlements, no peace with the killing of the Palestinians. I hope that the occupation is the occupation, either here or in Egypt and everywhere. It is a dirty occupation.
But you see, Dr. Hamad, the dilemma we're facing today is that with President Trump having changed the U.S. foreign policy, which has been for decades been standing at a point from where he's completely turned around, endorsing every move of Israel in its occupation. The problem is that the two-state solution and any efforts to build a lasting peace with the Palestinians is now seen pretty much, finished, because what we've seen in the past is, especially this year, is that not only has there been President Trump's endorsement of Israel's move, but what we've seen with US and Iran tensions, a lot of Arab countries have come out and openly stood next to Israel in their support. So how do we move forward from here? Is it just going to get worse and worse in 2020?
I think, as I said, we have to, as a Palestinians, we need to make an assessment, evaluation for the whole process. I think that the peace process, which is led by the Palestinian Authority, now it is failed. It is totally failed. We did not get anything from the peace process, just the negative things, settlements, killing, aggression, taking the lands. So I think we have to go back again now. First of all, we have to focus on the national unity. And second thing is to have a strategic vision for the Palestinians. How can we liberate our homeland? How can we struggle against the occupation? How can we stop building the settlements? And the third point, we need the support of the international community, who is keeping silence for the crimes of Israel. This problem is happening for 20, 30, 40 years, and they are watching Israel killing the Palestinians, taking their lands, violating the laws, the rules, everything. They destroy everything here.
Right. And
they don't do anything. I'm so astonished that the international community, they punish Iran, they punish Sudan, they punish Libya, they punish different countries, but when they reach to Israel, it is like the spoiled boy. No one dare to account Israel. So I think we need now to try to accept the international community now, to push him now to take some action against Israel, because if we keep silent for the crime of Israel, you will be surprised tomorrow that Israel tell the world that there is no Palestinians, no Palestinian territory, everything is over, and it's just the state of Israel. This is a big problem for us. It's a big challenge for the Palestinians, for the Muslims, for the Arabs. So that just one state, we need from the Muslims in order to focus again that the Palestinians' cause is the central issue for them. They should do something for them. The Palestinians are fighting alone. They are struggling alone. Are trying to fight against the occupation alone. No one support them. This is the problem. Oh, okay, we hear speeches from here and there, and we hear statements, but on the ground, nothing is done.
Nothing unfolds. Dr. Thank you so much for joining us. Israel has continued its blockade of the Gaza Strip in Palestine. They've killed over 200 people, a conservative estimate, and wounded over 6,000, at least in most this year. Dr. Zia, coming back to you, the sentiment is across the board whenever it comes to the issues that evolve from conflict zones, the problem of conflict resolution, that there are always roadblocks. We've seen it in Syria just recently, how Russia and China vetoed humanitarian help in the UNSC. I mean, as long as there is no recognition from the superpowers that dictate the political terms of countries that are pretty much indebted to them on all levels, it paints a very despondent picture for the future, that who has the back of these Kashmiris who not just today, not just this year, but for 7 decades have been in a matter of flux, have been in the middle of nowhere when it comes to the resolution of their territory.
Well, it does seem like that. Like, it is a very despondent picture, and we have to be extremely positive about the future in order to kind of think that there will be a resolution very close at hand. What we see currently in Kashmir is there is deep silence. Like, Kashmiris have gone into this huddle mode. This is what happens because when you are one of the densest militarized zones in the world, when you have no communication, it's technically at the moment, even though there is basic cable, some landlines are open, and some kind of prepaid or postpaid cell phone facilities are available. But essentially, Kashmir is under a communication lockdown. So for me, to be kind of watching Kashmir at the moment, I do not see it changed much from August 5th. It still is in that mode. It's under siege. It's under attack at the moment. And what we have seen in the past 5-6 months, and it's amazing that we say 5-6 months in such an easy way, because it is a long time for people to be without basic essential supplies. If we take into consideration the humanitarian concerns that are being raised on ground, the kind of problems that people are facing, the kind of problems that students are facing, so that's continuing. And no one has really been able to break that. There is no international pressure building on India and telling them. There has been a little bit of condonements and denouncements here and there, but there has been no stringent force from the powers that be. Recently, we saw the King and Queen of Sweden visit India. So they did issue a kind of denouncement. But again, that seemed very token. That seemed something, just paying an obeisance to this idea of justice. But at the same time, nothing got done. No one has been able to tell the government of India that this is wrong. And also, it's not just a humanitarian and a human rights issue at the moment, but at the same time, it's a political problem. It's a dispute that is recognized by the United Nations. It seems everything is kind of getting diluted in this huge idea that India is a growing economy, India is the next superpower in the region, India is the beacon of democracy. Well, at the same time, Kashmiris are trying to say that there has been anything in Kashmir but democracy since 1947. What the world has seen is just a mask of electoral democracy, but there has been no real democracy in Kashmir. And until and unless there is an international solidarity, that there is an international pressure that is being built from the people, from the governments, creating awareness around these issues, and the Kashmiris themselves on ground and in the diaspora, all of these coming together to change the narrative. I think this is an information war all out at the moment. Everyone is having their say, and Kashmiris are very silent at the moment, but they have laid their political stand, and they have made it much more clearer in the last 5 months what they want. And I think the ball is in the court of the international community to decide what they want and how they want these injustices that are being meted out to people across board, from Palestine to Kashmir, how they want them to be solved. And I think international solidarity is the only way, from grounds up, is the only way that we can deal with this.
Okay, Dr. Ather Zia, thank you so much. Fortunately, this is the only time we have, and we have to take a short break here, talking about the plight of Kashmiris and the Palestinians and Muslims generally across India, as they are seeing right now a revolution of sorts, as the BJP-led government once again and time and again since their tenure began with the landslide victory this year, introduces one law after the other discriminating against Muslims. We'll take a quick short break here and we'll come back with more analysis on different conflict zones in the Middle East. Welcome back to Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, we're going to talk a little about the Middle East, which has been a picture of unrest for most of recent history, and 2019 has not been any different. All conflicts in the Middle East and in Northern Africa, in fact, also have more common areas than they have differences. And this time round, also 2019, there was very little improvement in the lives of those living in these conflict zones. And even beyond the Middle East, if we're talking about conflict zones in Asia and beyond, we've seen in Afghanistan, we've seen it in Ukraine, Libya, Yemen, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the Sahel region in Africa. Thousands and people have lost their lives in these armed conflicts. The situation, especially in the Middle East, has been no different. So we're going to try and touch as many areas as we can with our panel of experts who I'm going to introduce now. We have with us Mr. Michael Arnold, an analyst and an editor, researcher at TRT World. He's joining us today from Istanbul. We also have with us Mr. Adel, Deshilah, an analyst and political analyst from Istanbul, joining us, and Mr. Sami, Hamdi, Middle East expert and editor-in-chief of the International Interest, geopolitical risk consultant, joining us from London today. Welcome to all three of you to Newswire. I want to start with you, Mr. Michael Arnold. We want to take a look at how, especially in Syria, in Yemen, and other conflict zones in the Middle East, the year has been, and especially what hope there is for these countries coming 2020. We've seen, especially with the latest, the Turkish operation northeastern Syria, in a way, the U.S. has taken a lot of heat because of President Trump's sudden announcement of withdrawing his troops from there, and then that U-turn was followed by keeping some troops to protect the oil fields. The criticism that Turkey has faced on the operation that so many have lost their lives in and been displaced in creating that buffer zone. Moving forward, how do you see 2020 unfolding for the kind of moves that Turkey is expected to make in Syria?
Well, there's a lot to that question. So let's see if we can try to unpack a little bit. With regards to Syria, of course, I think it's in some ways you can say that the overall conflict is winding down. Many people are saying that, but another way to look at it is just to understand that it's shifting. So the dynamics of the conflict are shifting. It's shifting into a new phase. With regards to Turkey's operation in northeast Syria, it remains to be seen, what the final outcome of that will be. Of course, we saw very sort of rapid developments as that operation was taking place. We had the United States withdrawing them from their positions in sort of this very unusual scenario of seeing American soldiers handing over bases to Russians. So we've seen, this gap filled, that the United States left filled by Russia and the Syrian regime to a certain extent. And then, on the backs of that, Turkey began to deal with Russia in terms of its primary concern in northeast Syria, which of course is the presence of the PKK-linked YPG. So I don't think, necessarily we'll see much different, actions from Turkey in that regard. That remains their primary, objective in Syria, and of course creating areas and creating scenarios in not only the northeast but across the rest of the country that at least the ones that are under their influence that will see the return of the voluntary return of course of Syrian refugees. So I think we're likely to see that same the same direction from Turkey, at least as far as Syria goes. Just on that note, though, right? Of course, Syria. I think it's important to start with that in many ways because it represents in many ways we could say a microcosm of trends that are moving across the region in general. We have, what seems to be American withdrawal from the region as a whole. We have the increased presence of Russia, of course, and we have increased emboldening of local actors. In Syria's case, we have the Kurdish groups, and of course, we have others across the region as well. So it's I think it's a good place to start the discussion.
And Yemen, it has been affected very badly. Of course, it's become the world's biggest humanitarian crisis. Now, Mr. Deshilah, we've seen that it's been troubled by civil wars for decades. I mean, the current conflict obviously got worse when the Saudi-led coalition intervened on behalf of the internationally recognized government against the Houthi rebels, who were, of course, aligned with the former President Ali Abdullah Saleh. But it's taken thousands of lives, and even now, it seems that the world stands completely useless. The international forums, which are supposed to intervene in conflict resolution, have absolutely achieved nothing. The peace process that was brokered in Stockholm did nothing for it. With 2019 over, and reflecting back on what has transpired this past year, how do you see 2020 unfolding for the Yemeni people?
I would like to emphasize that 2019 was the worst year in the history of Yemen. For example, in August 2019, the separatist militias and the regional supporters took control of Yemen's interim capital, Aden. And the civilian casualties are higher than last year. Millions of Yemenis suffer from shortage of food and medical care. And now we have a military coup in Sana'a and supported by Iranian regime. So many crimes were committed against innocent people during 2019, and at the same time, we have to focus on the agreement between the Yemeni government and the separatist militias on 5th of November 2019. Till now, nothing has changed. That means the humanitarian crisis in Yemen remains the worst in the world, and nearly 5 years of conflict has forced more than 5 million people to leave their homes. Over 24 million people, or nearly 80% of the population, require humanitarian assistance and protection. Personal safety and food security remain two of the biggest challenges people face in Yemen. And you know that 2 million of children are outside of schools. So now the situations in Yemen are very bad, and unfortunately we are looking for peace. Maybe Yemenis cannot see peace in 2020.
Okay, Mr. Deshilah. But Mr. Arnold, reflecting back in the situation, not just for Syria, where by some estimates, in fact, the United Nations issued this report where 400,000 people are supposedly been killed in Syria since the start of the war. But since the beginning of January, we've seen over 5.6 million have fled the country. This in itself creates this huge influx of refugees, not only a big problem for Turkey itself, but also Europe generally. The issue of the kind of intervention the US had, the involvement it had, would you say with now the current players, predominantly Turkey and Russia, the US influence in the region has waned?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. With regards to Syria, I mean, although it's arguable to the extent that U.S. influence was ever that significant, with the exception of perhaps the very earliest years of the uprising. But yeah, definitely, we have a situation now where Russia is the main player in Syria. Turkey is a significant player and it holds some cards in its hands. And of course, we have Iran as well, which it's a major player as well. The thing is all of these different parties have different interests in Syria, and these are not completely disconnected, although they have been compartmentalized from their other issues, which of course they work together on a number of issues, including in Syria. But you know, it's important to understand that yes, these are the main players, but they all have sort of different interests. Again, Turkey's main interest is its security corridor along the northeast, and of course the issue of refugees. The President Erdogan has made it very clear that Turkey can't handle any more Syrian refugees, and so you know it will be keen to prevent that. Of course, Russia, for its part, has that as leverage against Turkey to get what it wants from Turkey, not only in Syria but in other places as well. The fact that Turkey says it cannot handle refugees is something that can be used to try to pressure them to make decisions in other regards. Iran, of course, for its part, as we can see that their lack of involvement in the current fighting in Idlib, or the lack of at least Iranian allied militias, is the fact that you know their interests are different in Syria. They are there to maintain their land route from Tehran to Beirut, and so as long as that road is secured, they're not particularly concerned with the rest of the country. So we have overlapping but different interests of these particular three powers in Syria. At this point, with very few exceptions, it appears that the United States is mostly on the outside of this.
So, Mr. Sami Hamdi, how do you view conflicts in Middle East, and not only in terms of the commonalities they have, but also in terms of the differences? Because when we talk about the US's presence here, especially since President Trump came into power, it almost seems that even though they might have the most military bases in the region, their influence or their stake, it seems, is waning in the region. Do you see it that way, or do you think that this entire dispute in Middle East is the resurgence of different powers?
I think first and foremost, we have to establish the context with which these conflicts are taking place. This has all come about because the international community doesn't know what to do with the fact that people protested, brought down regimes and wanted freedoms. They wanted to be able to choose their own governments. They wanted to be able to actually dictate their own future with their own hands. I say this because when the Arab Spring happened, when Tunisia decided to vote for Islamist parties, when the Islamists came to the fore in Libya, when the Islamists came to the fore in Egypt, when they were leading the opposition in Syria, instead of the world welcoming these election results, instead of the world saying, okay, fine, these countries have democracy, they have decided who they want to rule, let's respect that and let's deal with that. Instead, the EU decided to put conditions on their loans to say we need to understand first, is Islam compatible with democracy? The US began to empower liberal movements. They said, you guys, you voted wrong. We wanted those liberal movements. When Bashar al-Assad, when the movement went to Syria, Bashar al-Assad realized that the international community is not entirely pro-Arab Spring. They're not entirely behind this idea of the people taking over. And this is why they sat back while Bashar al-Assad massacred his people. I say this not because that they were evil or anything. It's the fact that the US and the EU had no idea how to react to this sudden people power. They were so used to having Ben Ali, who was in Tunisia, who was a dictator running everything, so used to Mubarak, so used to having vassal presidents, that they didn't know how to deal with a free and democratic nations emerging in the Middle East. And as a result, when these regimes felt that there was hesitancy from the international community, they began to use force to suppress the people. And this then allowed the international community to start saying, okay, now that we're in the midst of a civil war, now we're in the midst of the conflict, the Americans said we need to protect our influence. Russia said this is a chance for me to gain influence. This is a chance for me to be the new ally, the new backer. Oh, Egypt, remember how the US abandoned Mubarak? I won't abandon Sisi in Egypt if you come to me. The Americans abandoned Mohammed bin Nayef. I won't abandon you. Come to me. The Turks got caught up in all of this. They believed that they were going to benefit from the Arab Spring. They believed that the parties that won the elections would be pro-Turkey. When it saw that its allies were falling one by one, it panicked. It decided, I also need to insulate myself. I need to make sure Syria is safe. I need to make sure that the Americans don't do to me what they did to Morsi in Egypt, for example. These were the attitudes. So the conflicts became a free-for-all. Why? Because none of the countries, none of them wanted to accept that the people actually wanted this desire for free will. And I know this sounds like activist terminology, but this is actually the reality of what happened. There were actually deep concerns that the fact that the people were choosing Islamic-leaning parties, and the proof of this is in 2014, let's take an example. In Tunisia, Nahda were the majority government in Tunisia, but the minority liberal parties, who combined made only 10% of the entire electoral vote, took to the streets, they protested, they managed to get people onto the streets, and the international community, rather than coming in and saying, everybody, let's respect democracy, there are elections after 1 year, they said, Nahda, you must form a coalition government, you must give a dialogue, you must surrender all of that democratic gains that you've got, and as a result, they became a minor partner in a coalition government, and the people who organized the protest received the Nobel Peace Prize. So in other words, when we see these attitudes, you had groups now, and I'll give you, just so I won't take too long, let me give an example of some of the discussions taking place in the community elsewhere. When we were growing up as youngsters, we were taught that democracy is a good way, that we should encourage it, and that it is compatible with Islam. And the more extreme elements, they said, that if we go with democracy, the Westerners will never accept to allow us to dictate our own will. Now, when you had Mohammed Morsi in Egypt, a population of 100 million, a vital country of importance, and he won by democratic means. He won in elections. He won in free and fair elections. And then he's overthrown by a military coup, and the international community does nothing. Then let's suppose, I'm not saying I'm condoning it, but if you're somebody who is amenable to extremism, suddenly when you're telling him that democracy is the way forward, he will tell you why. We tried democracy, and look what happened. The international community didn't stay with Mohammed Morsi. This is why we have terrorist groups now, they're encouraging to popping up in Syria, in Libya, and the like, because now you have a community that is soul-searching. You have an international community that is soul-searching. We said democracy for so many years, but my goodness, when it came, people voted wrong. So what do we do about this now? And that's the real issue. And I finish on this point. Sisi and Egypt, we should remember why they enjoy support from the international community, because they use the same rhetoric, the same language. I am fighting terrorism. I am bringing stability. It is not about I am bringing rights. I am bringing democracy. I am bringing the like. And this is why it is a disaster. This whole thing started because nobody wanted to accept that the Arab states wanted to choose their own leaders. And the international community and the world said, no, you're not ready.
Right. It absolutely, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. And Mr. Deshilah, I'd like your comments on this, and we'll come to you, Mr. Arnold, after that the international community not only, whether you see it as the international community being confused, not knowing how to handle it, or that this is, at the end of the day, forming alliances to meet their own ends, to reach their own agenda, whether it is Turkey securing a corridor from terrorists, or whether establishing its own domination in a region which is full of gas reserves, and also protecting trade routes.
I would like to tell you that international community didn't take care of humanitarian crisis or of innocent people. International community just is trying to, for example, to save or to keep their interest in the Middle East and in Yemen in general. So when we are talking about international community will not side with innocent people in the Arab world. International community, or I mean that the international powers, I mean United U.S. and other Russia and Britain and other governments in the international community use these militias in Yemen and other areas to achieve their political aims. These militias are considered as a tool in the hands of the international community. So how can international community help us? When we talk about international community, we are speaking about new colonizers. So
no, exactly. But Mr. Deshilah, just like that, what has the UK done? Supposed to be holding they're the diplomatic penholders of Yemen's file in the UNSC. What exactly have they achieved in terms of brokering peace in a region that has been in conflict for decades?
So Yemen is under the chapter number 7. I mean that Yemen is under the Security Council. So that how international community after 5 years of conflict in Yemen didn't do anything for Yemenis. So if they, for example, if they want to see peace in Yemen, they have to help people there, and they have to achieve and they have to impose sanctions against these militias in South Yemen and North Yemen and other areas. International community didn't take care of what is happening on the ground. They try to keep their interests. They are trying just to support this side against this side, this part against this party, like this. So we didn't take care of international community. In my opinion, if we want to see a political solution.
If you want a political solution, maybe it's time that the international community needs to step back. But that's exactly the problem there, Mr. Arnold, because even with Libya and Turkey backing the UN-recognized government, the struggle right now is that those in the EU are not entirely on board. We've seen France, we've seen, besides the EU countries, we've seen UAE, we've seen supporting Khalifa Haftar, the renegade warlord, who is the main reason right now that Libya is in so much turmoil. So I suppose the question to you is, as this turmoil gets worse and only a handful are backing the UN-recognized government, how do you see Turkey making any progress in bringing a solution to the region with the kind of influence it now has in the Middle East?
But yeah, I think there's 2 points to that. First, I just want to kind of build on something that Mr. Hamdi was speaking about in terms of this sort of what, maybe we could refer to as either explicit or let's say implicit Islamophobia that seems to have informed Western policy in particular. I mean, we have seen this repeatedly throughout the region, and exactly as he pointed out, countries such as and Egypt in particular have actually built on this language, have built on the same type of what we could call fear of Muslim language in order to bolster the security of their regimes. Exactly as he was saying we are the ones that can bring security and stability to this region, and at the same time we'll do these piecemeal, social reforms that seem to be so popular, at least amongst the Western public, at least if not the Western government. So I think that's a factor that can't be discounted in terms of the dynamic in the region. Of course, there are other things at play. We have, if we're talking about resources, money, etc., as the old adage goes, follow the money and you'll find your answers. That's often the case as well. In terms of Libya in particular, and Turkey there, it's a very fluid situation at this point, and I think a lot can happen. And in fact, it's a very dangerous situation at this point. At the same time, it's very clear that that Turkey's latest moves, particularly the signing of the MOU with the Government of National Accord in Tripoli, has got things moving. Now, all of a sudden, the Europeans, which have been sort of sitting on this file and dealing their thumbs for a matter of time, maybe with the exception of France, who has been openly supporting Haftar for some time now, along with they're now moving because they're concerned about Turkish influence, particularly in Libya. And so, now they're holding meetings with Sarraj and others based in Tripoli to try to get the situation under control. And I think from Turkey's end, they would be more than satisfied with the fact that this may actually bring about negotiations in Libya, which could lead to a solution down the road on something that has been not moving amongst the international community for so long. So, those moves have actually stimulated some movement on that file.
Right. Okay, so we've unfortunately run out there. Mr. Michael Arnold, Mr. Adel, Deshilah, and Mr. Sami Hamdi, thank you so much for joining here the conversation, essentially to talk about those 2 billion people who are right now living across various conflict zones around the world. And that in itself is driving 80% of the world's humanitarian needs. And what is the reason behind them? This complex situation, as it threatens to implode, it's not just the poverty, but also the kind of generational influence it will have in inculcating more extremism, more violence, and resulting to more instability. And the powers that be, what they have done and what it seems like will happen in 2020, we've essentially tried to touch on. But with that, we've come to the end of the program. We will see you tomorrow with more news and analysis on not just conflict zones, but the most happening news from around the world.